So now on with the presentation. This slide shows a diagram which provides you with an overview of our education standards and the programme that we've been working on over the last 3.5 years. The first line shows the standards that have been completed and published ready for implementation. And these include the standards for education, which I'll go into in a little bit more detail in a moment, the future nurse standards proficiencies, the nursing associate standard proficiencies, and the standards for prescribing. On the second line, you've got the future midwife standards and proficiencies. These are due to go out to publication next week on the 12th, so do watch out for this and join in with that consultation. And the return to practice standards, which have already been out for consultation, are just being finalised following this event that took place last year. Along with all of this work lies the quality assurance framework, and that enables approval of the programmes and ongoing monitoring. If we move to the next slide, this provides us with an overview of the standards for education and training. If you look to the upper left, Part 1, Standards Framework for Nursing and Midwifery Education. This also involves now nursing associates. Then these are the top level standards that education institutions, along with their practice learning partners, will adhere to. The second part, Standards for Student Supervision and Assessment. These are just the next ones along, and this will be the new approach to learning and assessment, which will replace mentorship. These two sets of standards, Part 1 and Part 2, are actually applied to all of our approved programmes moving forward. In the middle here, we've got Part 3, Programme Standards. This is a library of standards that will include the pre-qualifying nursing programmes, the nursing associate programmes, and the standards for prescribing programmes currently, and will be joined by return to practice later this year and midwifery once the consultation is completed. And then on the right, the proficiencies for nursing and midwifery professions. These will include also the nursing associates, but they will be the programme standards that we've already got published, that we've already alluded to, the nursing proficiencies, the prescribing will be the adoption of the Royal Pharmaceutical Society competency framework, and we will also have in there the nursing associate proficiencies. I'm now going to hand over to Rachel, who will explore the standards for student supervision and assessment in more detail with you. So if you have any questions as we go through, please do send them in to us. We will field these and we'll start to answer them at the end of the presentation.
Hello all, it's Rachel here. I'm sure some of you recognise my voice, and it's great to have you all with us today. So I'm just going to go into sort of the detail of the new standards for student supervision and assessment in this part of the presentation. So on your screen you should see a kind of overview of the standards themselves, the standards for student supervision and assessment. If you've been through the standards, if you've had a look at them, this shouldn't be news for you. So there are 3 headings. The first one is effective practice learning, and that kind of deals with kind of broad, high-level standards relating to how practice learning should be delivered and run as a whole. The second heading is supervision and students, and this is where we talk in detail about the practice supervisor role. And then the final heading is assessment of students and confirmation of proficiency, and this is the part of the standards that deals with the academic and the practice assessor roles. So that's a kind of just a brief overview of what the standards themselves look like. On the next slide, I'm just going to talk a little bit about practice supervision. So although this isn't the focus of the webinar, we know that of course supervision and assessment are interconnected. So this is just kind of a bit of background on the practice supervisor role and practice supervision as a whole, if you're not that familiar with it. So our new standards, we say that students will be supervised in practice by any suitably qualified and experienced registered health and social care professional. So this is a change from the current standards where we say it must be a nurse or a midwife or a skipper. Now it can be any registered health and social care professional who has been kind of suitably prepared and has the right experience to help support the student. So by registered health and social care professional, we mean anybody who's registered with a professional regulator, such as the NMC or the GMC. So this could be, so it would be nurses and midwives, but it also might be a doctor, it might be a pharmacist, it might be a social worker. There's lots of different people it could be. And who it would be different in different circumstances. So what it's about is really about identifying who in your environment or across environments can help students achieve their learning outcomes. We would expect that all nurses and midwives should be able to transition into this role. They might need additional preparation, but it should be sort of really a part of their everyday role of being a nurse and midwife. So supervisors themselves can have lots of different roles. You can do supervision in lots of different ways. We're not going to say that there's any one right way of doing it. It's really about thinking about, what the student needs, what their outcomes are, what the environment is or are, and what kind of models of supervision you can apply to help them meet their learning outcomes. This will ultimately be for education providers to decide. We're not going to tell you how to do it. But what we are saying is, as you'll see on your screen, that you must ensure that practice supervision ensures safe and effective learning experiences, and also that there is sufficient coordination and continuity of support and supervision of students. So those are two very important standards to consider when you're thinking about models of supervision. Again, this can mean different things in different circumstances. The whole point of our new standards is really about allowing you to personalise the supervision that's provided to your student and your service needs. Okay, so that's just a brief overview of practice supervision. So on the next slide, we're going to talk about the assessor role. So this is the main sort of point of this webinar, as you know. So just to give you a brief overview of the two roles that we're setting in the new standards. So all students must be assigned to a practice assessor for a placement or a series of placements. That's really up to you to decide. About what would work best in your area, what would work best for students. You could have one practice assessor across 3 placements, or you could have one for each. That's really up to you to decide. The students must also be assigned to an academic assessor for each part of the education programme. So what is meant by part of the programme is, again, really up to you. A part just needs to be the period of time for which a decision on progression must be made. So that could be a practice placement, or it could be an academic term or an academic year. Again, we're not specifying. You really need to just decide what this would mean, what would work best in your area, and be able to give us evidence that you've taken the right decision, essentially, that your decision upholds public safety and helps students to meet their learning outcomes. So the assessors are registered nurses, midwives, nursing associates, or SCIFANs with appropriate equivalent experience for the student's area of practice. That is surprisingly hard to say. So what we mean by this, I think we've had a lot of questions. What exactly do you mean by this? So what we're saying is that a nurse will still need to be assessed by a nurse, and a midwife will still need to be assessed by a midwife, and a SCIFAN by a SCIFAN, and a nursing associate by a nursing associate, but or a nurse in that particular case. However, unlike at the moment where we're saying, a children's nurse must be assessed by a children's nurse, etc., if you work in an area where you do have a field of practice, your assessor no longer needs to be field specific. So, for example, a children's nurse wouldn't necessarily need to be assessed by somebody who has the children's nursing registration. They could be assessed by somebody who has an adult nursing registration who has the appropriate equivalent experience for the outcomes that the student is trying to achieve. So, for example, it could be an adult nurse who has a postgraduate qualification in children's nursing that the NMC doesn't recognise, because we know that there are lots out there. Or it could be an adult nurse who has worked for 20 years in a children's nursing department, so has actually that knowledge and that expertise. They just don't happen to have the qualification registered with the NMC. So it's really just about kind of matching the skills and experience of your assessors with the outcomes that the student is trying to achieve. And again, it's up to you to decide what this would mean in individual circumstances. You just need to be able to evidence to us that your decision upheld public protection, public safety, and helps the students meet their learning outcomes. So for students on prescribing courses, their assessors can be any suitably qualified prescriber. So that could be a doctor, as it is at the moment, or it could be a nurse with the equivalent prescribing qualification, or it could be a prescribing pharmacist. So there's lots of different individuals who could be the academic assessor for a student on a prescribing course. So that's a brief overview of the assessor roles, what they are kind of on a high level way. On the next slide, I'm just going to go into a bit more detail about the practice assessor. So the two roles do have slightly different responsibilities as expressed within our standards. The practice assessor's basic role is to assess the student's achievement of practice learning for the period of time they are assigned to them. So for example, if they're assigned to them for a placement, they'd be assessing the learning, the student's learning within that placement, what they have learned, if they've achieved their learning outcomes, or if it's over several placements, they would be doing the same. So again, that's really up to you to decide which model you're going to go with. Their decisions will be informed by lots of different sources. So it might be student documentation, it might be feedback from the practice supervisors, and it would also be some direct observation or potentially working alongside the student. It's very important to note that we don't expect or require the practice assessor to physically be in the practice environment alongside their students. We also don't say how or when the practice assessor should observe students, only that it must form part of their overall evidence base. Again, it's up to you to decide what model you're going to go with, what model works best, and to think about how you can evidence that this is holding public safety. So that's the role that all of the practice assessors will have. That's their basic role. But on top of that, one practice assessor will also then work with the academic assessor to recommend the student for progression from one part of the programme to the next. So as the student might have several practice assessors in one part of a programme, so for example, if a part of a programme is an academic year and you have 3 placements within that, and you have 1 practice assessor per placement, that would be 3 practice assessors per part. So because of that, not all practice assessors will necessarily fulfill this aspect of the role, and we're not saying that they have to. So it may be that the practice assessor in the final placement performs this role. They might make the recommendation for progression with the academic assessor, or it might be that you decide that actually you want one additional practice assessor that works across the whole of the part and takes feedback from all the different practice assessors that worked within that and then makes the recommendation. Again, it's really up to you to decide what works best for you in your area. But whoever it is that is working with the practices, the academic assessor, to make the recommendation for progression, they'll need to take a view, obviously, across the whole part, because that is the part in which they're considering. So they'll need to sort of go back and look at the student documentation, potentially talk to practice assessors that have worked previously with the student across that part, because they need to take that overall view of the whole part of the programme, essentially to work with the academic assessor. Okay, so that's just a brief overview of what the practice assessor does. As I've said, there's lots of different ways to implement this. There's lots of different approaches. So moving on to the next slide, onto the academic assessor. So as I said, this role is slightly different to that of the practice assessor due to the fact that the academic environment and academic learning is structured in a slightly different way. Excuse me, just taking a drink of water. So rather than assessing, what we're saying is that the academic assessor collates and confirms student achievement of proficiencies and programme outcomes in the academic environment for each part of the programme. And in doing this, they have to work within existing AI processes whenever relevant. This is because we know that the academic environment already has a lot of these structures in place for collating student achievement. So we don't want to create a new process on top of that, really. There will be these structures that already exist and they can work easily within them. So as they are assigned to a student for a part of the programme, a key part of this role will be to work with the assigned practice assessor to make recommendations for progression for the student from one part to the next. And this also includes at the final part of the programme. So again, it's very important that when doing this work, this aspect of their role, they work within existing AEI processes. So for example, it might mean making a recommendation to an exam board who would then make the final decision. So again, we know that you've got these processes in place. We're not saying just throw all these processes out. We're saying that this role can work within these processes quite happily. So one thing that I think has been raised with us quite a few times, which I think some people might already have asked, that I can address now, is that the academic assessor is not there to oversee the work of the practice assessor. They're not going to be signing off their assessments. They don't have to go into practice with them and almost mediate their assessments. Both the practice and the academic assessor have their own areas of expertise, and they bring them to this process. And neither one is there to kind of sign off or oversee the other person's assessment. They work together in partnership. It's about bringing the academic and the practice learning together so that they can work together in partnership. And it may be that you have times in which they disagree. And we would expect education providers to have processes in place to manage this. But we're not going to say exactly how that will be done. So in some cases, you may have more practice assessors in a part than academic assessors, as I mentioned before. For example, if you have a practice assessor for each placement, and there are 3 placements in a part of a programme. So this is why we set the standard that you'll see up on your screen here, around communication and collaboration being scheduled for relevant points in the programme. So this is to make sure that the academic and the practice assessor are talking to each other at the right times for student progression. So, if you do have sort of 3 placements in a part, you need to decide internally really when the practice and the academic assessor are going to need to communicate with each other in order for them to make a proper recommendation for student progression. There's another very important point in this area, which is that we're not specifying that the practice and academic assessors must physically meet with each other. So that's another thing that comes up quite a lot when we say this. People say, oh, but how could I get out to all these areas? How could I travel? I can't have all these meetings. That's too much time. We're not saying that they have to physically meet. We're not specifying how they will make their recommendation or how they work with each other. It's really up to you to think about how you can manage this in your area, what will work best for your area. So that's, again, another brief overview of the academic assessor and the practice assessor and how they'll work together. Again, there are lots of different ways to implement this role. It's really up to you to think about what will work best in your area. So on the next slide, we've got a visual. Okay, so this just gives you something to look at really, that kind of gives you an idea of how these relationships might work. So as you see down the left-hand side, you've got the standards. As Sue said earlier, standards for student supervision and assessment are part of a suite of standards, and it's important to consider them in context. So there will be standards that relate to supervision and assessment in part 1. It's just that they might be very high level standards, just generally about kind of governance. And in part 3, which will be the program standards for each program, there might be very specific standards that relate to supervision and assessment that specifically relate to your part of the register. So they do need to be considered in context. On the right hand side, you've just got a little visual that kind of gives you an idea of how the relationship should work. So a practice and an academic assessor, the student is assigned a practice and an academic assessor for whatever period of time. And each of those people need to have an independent relationship with the student and need to independently talk to the student. But they then also, the practice and the academic assessor, need to talk to each other. Again, this does not indicate a tripartite sign-off process. We're not saying that they need to meet. It isn't necessarily what you currently do. And there is scope for kind of innovative ways of approaching student assessment in this way. Okay, so I hope that visual helped a little bit. On the next slide, we're going to talk about something that also might help you a little bit. So this is the supporting information. So we know that that's a lot to take in. I'm sure a lot of you are probably still feeling a little confused right now. So what we've done is we've produce some supporting information for these new standards. So a lot of what I've talked about today will be covered in it, and I'm sure actually a lot of the questions that you're asking right now will be covered in this supporting information. It's not a new set of standards for you to follow at all. It's really just kind of examples of things you might want to consider when you're implementing the standards. So, for example, you know, what do you need to think about when you're thinking about a model of supervision? What do you need to think about when you're thinking about preparing your assessors? But again, we're really not going to be telling you what to do. It's really about what works best in your area. So it's currently split into 5 sections, as you can see on your screen. So the first one's practice supervision, and that deals with the practice supervisor role, practice supervision more generally. Second one, practice assessment, again deals with the practice assessor role, but also practice assessment more generally. And again, for the academic assessment section, academic assessor, but also academic assessment more widely. So these 3 first sections are currently online. So do please take a look at those. The next 2 sections, learning environments and experience and student empowerment, should be online very soon. I think we have a bit of time, so if we do, I can just briefly get the supporting information up on the screen and just show you what it looks like, really. I'm not going to go into it in any real detail. Let's just see if we can do it. If we can't, then it doesn't matter. It's quite a complicated procedure. If you are looking to find it, then you can just do a Google search, supporting information for standards for student supervision and assessment, or if you go to the section of our website on the standards for student supervision and assessment, if you scroll down to the bottom, there's a link there on that page. So as you can see on the page now, so this is basically what it looks like. You click on so if you click on practice supervision or introduction, you go through, then you'll see that there are guides within that you can look at. So if we just click on practice supervision quickly, you see there's lots of stuff in here. You know, who can be a practice supervisor? What kind of preparation can they have? What do they do? Again, if you click through, you'll see that we're not actually telling you what they do. We're saying they can do these things. These are different ways of implementing it. Maybe you'd like to think about this, that, and the other. So hopefully that will be a great resource for you. So thank you, Johnette, for getting that up just now. So that's the supporting information. Do please take a look at it, because yes, it might answer some of your questions. We've also had a think about some things that you might want to consider. So this isn't questions that we're asking you right now, so please don't feel like you have to start typing your answers to these questions, because they're not questions. They're just things that you might want to consider if you're thinking about a new model. So first of all, the need for effective partnerships between AEIs and practice learning partners. So that's really at the heart of everything that we've done. It cuts through all our standards. You'll notice in the stems we say AEIs with their practice learning partners. So really what we're saying is that you need to work together. It's not about the academic environment and the practice environment working separately and then joining up. It needs to be designed and to work together. We're also saying around the introduction of the new roles that here are some things you might like to think about. So what supervision and assessment model will work in your practice learning environments? So what model are you going to go with? You know, there's lots of different ways to implement it, as we discussed in our supporting information. What would work best for your area? How can you be innovative? What can you do now that you'd always wanted to do but you couldn't do before? You also might want to think about who your supervisors and assessors will be. Who do you have in your current workforce who could potentially transition to the new roles? But also, as in the case of supervisors, they can be any registered health and social care professional. So is there anyone else in your environment that you'd like to make use of who isn't a nurse or a midwife? And you might also want to think about how they will be prepared for this role, because obviously we're moving away from the current system where we're approving an NMC course that all mentors and sign-off mentors, etc., have to go on, and saying that they must be suitably prepared and setting some high-level standards for that. So there are different ways in which this can be done, and this again opens up the possibility of kind of an innovative approach for you to take. So it's something for you to think about, what kind of preparation you're going to use, what is the relevant and correct preparation for each role. So in terms of the impacts of the new standards on all registrants, so all registrants really need to be aware of the new roles for supervision and assessment, because they are going to be mostly the ones who are fulfilling them. So if you've got people who are currently mentors, what does this mean for them? Are they going to transition into one of the new roles, and how would they do that? Or if you've got people who aren't currently mentors or sign-off mentors because for whatever reason, could they become practice supervisors? You know, is this actually an opportunity to engage your workforce more? I mean, you know, what we are saying is that really anyone could be a supervisor, so there's no reason all nurses and midwives in an environment couldn't be a supervisor. So for individual registrants, so we're going to be setting new standards for proficiency. Obviously, we've got the new nursing standards, and we're going to be having the new midwifery standards soon. So it's about kind of thinking about those are coming, and what does this mean for your scope of practice, you know? And again, obviously, revalidation, this is a reality for all of you. So if you're taking on one of the new roles, if you're having a look at the new standards of proficiency, this should feed into your CPD in terms of revalidation.
And there's more information on the proficiencies page under the frequently asked questions as well. So do go there and have a look and see what that means for you with regards to working within your scope and your revalidation plans.
Okay, great. Okay, so that is a whirlwind tour. I hope that's helped.